So, some coppicing basics. I think one of the first basics with coppicing has got to be light. When you are looking at coppicing and cutting, you've got to get as much light to the forest floor as possible. And that's because if it's too shady, the stools you cut, the stumps or stools I call them, they will die and you'll have no coppice rods in the future. So that for me is a fundamental. Concentrate on getting as much light, so that will mean not just cutting one stool and hoping that will do it. You've got to cut an awful lot of stools. Now traditionally they tended to cut an acre, a coop or an enclosure where the coppice was. The coop means to cut. The coop would have been about an acre, and they would have cut that in the winter, and they would have several acres on rotation then, so each year they would cut another acre while that previous cut was starting to grow. And so you can give it as and in a coppice and standard situation, that's coppice with an overstory of larger trees, there may only be about 8 to 10 coppice, there may only be about 8 to 10 standards, that's the big tall trees, in an acre, with perhaps some smaller ones growing in amongst them ready for the future generations. So we can see light really is important. Now I don't cut anywhere near an acre at a time. I'll maybe cut perhaps an area with about 100 stools in, which is probably not even a tenth of an acre. But as long as you get as much light in as possible, so you might have to cut some of the edge trees out, you've got to do a bit of thinning on the edges so you can get as much light to the stools as possible. We can talk a little bit about stool height. That's the level that you cut down to. Now I tend to cut an awful lot of hazel, and you want to try and cut as close to the ground as possible, especially with hazel, because it can tend to send up shoots from the side of the stool and from the edges of the stool as well. So I'll show you this one. Try to cut this as low as possible. You can see where it's been previously cut. That's the dark, that's the dark black areas, that's been previously cut. That's this cut, and we're about 3 inches off the ground here. Now as the stools get bigger, it's almost impossible to try and keep them ultra low, but it's just nice to keep them nice and low, and then sometimes you'll get fresh rods come out from the side here, just around about soil level, mainly with hazel and willow perhaps, but not with other species like chestnut or sycamore or oak. You don't tend to get that, not from there anyway. So keep your stools nice and low without trashing your chainsaw at the same time. Another factor when cutting hazel is why. Why would you cut such a large area down? Why not thin, which is a more modern way of doing it, where you cut odd trees out, maybe a third at a time. Coppicing is, as we mentioned, cutting out this whole area of stools and trees. And I feel, I'm perhaps a little biased on this, I feel it's one of the best woodland management styles in the UK. And that's because it benefits the wildlife in far more ways than having big tall trees does. It's a very ancient form of woodland management, and it's very low impact. You don't need big machinery for it. You can often just use pedestrian access in and out, lightweight materials, which means you can get them in and out without causing compaction and problems like that. So for me it's a very good woodland management, one of the best woodland management styles. But also why is because of product. Now again, because I cut hazel for product to earn a living, then perhaps I'm a little bit biased, but the coppice for product versus coppice for conservation argument, I may well upset a few people on it, because I feel to cut for product is more important than cutting for conservation, because to cut for conservation may depend on grant aid and other factors to do with volunteer help and things like that, which is great. I'm not knocking it, but to cut for product means that somebody's going to earn a living, and that means that they're going to be more motivated to go and earn a living than the volunteer worker who's trying to do a bit of weekend woodland management because it suits their schedule. Whoa, hang on a minute, you can't say that, you'll offend all the conservationists. Oh yeah, you're right, I've not put it like that. Certainly didn't mean to offend any conservationists because they do an incredible job. Coppicing in the spare time, out the weekends, filthy wet, freezing cold. So I'm sorry guys, if you're a conservation coppicer, keep ploughing on. See, that's much better. Whereas a woodlander, a woodsman or a woodswoman will be in there cutting because they need to earn a living. And the conservation side of it comes naturally, which is what it always has done. The benefit to butterflies and insects and wildlife and bees and birds and mammals from coppicing will come naturally because somebody is cutting for product. So that's where I stand on the whole why we do it. One of the other things that tends to come in really with conservation coppice cutting, you've probably seen the book here, Remindable. Conservation coppice cutting is you tend to end up in a coppice that's never been touched for years. Now you've got sort of what I call 4 classifications. You've got a derelict hazel coppice, which means it's not been cut in probably 50 years, and the stools, the stems of the stools are going to be massive, especially with hazel. They're all going to look like a singled out tree. Rather than being multi-stemmed, you might end up with 3 stems on it now. So that's neglected. Then you've got overstood, which for me is something that's been cut before but hasn't been cut in quite a long time. So probably getting on for hazel about 20 years. For other species like oak, it might be an awful lot longer, decades and decades. So I'm specifically talking about hazel really. Well, the principles apply. But so yeah, that you've got neglected, you've got overstood, then you've got out of cycle. So hazel tends to be cut between sort of 6 and 7 years, 8 years really in the UK. Now, out of cycle means it's probably missed a cut, so it might be getting on for sort of 14, 15 years old. And some of the stems are getting pretty big by that point. And then you've got in cycle, which we spoke about. Every 5, 6, 7 years, the hazel gets cut, and that's in cycle hazel. Now the other thing that I found people don't tend to talk a lot about, and I got absolutely no instruction on this when I first started, because I was a bit of a woodland warrior in a way. I just went ahead and did it. I'd been trained in forestry, but I wanted to do coppicing, so I just read a few books, cracked on and started having a go. And there's some really good books that I recommend, and there's some that are quite hard reading if you're a first time coppice starter. So I'll perhaps put some in the description a bit further down. Have a look, I'll put a couple of links. And there's some books definitely worth reading, and other books that are a bit more of a reference material as opposed to a how-to. Anyway, I'll stop rambling. Product is, I'm here working in what I would call out of rotation. So the landowner cut this once. It was planted about 22 years ago. In the last 10 to 12 years it has been cut, but not cut since. So it's sort of getting on for almost overstood in a way. There's some bits at the back end that really are overstood because they've never actually been cut. Foreground just here. But it's getting you, when you're first starting, it's getting your head around all the materials and what you need. So, hedge laying stake, that's those there. Those are for hedge laying. They are 5'6" long, and the diameter of those is anything up to about 2 inch, from about possibly 1 inch. 1 inch at the thin end, up to 2 inch diameter. You don't want them any bigger than that, really. There's another example. That's hedge laying stakes. And then we move on to beam poles. These are 8 foot long and are the sort of next scale down from a hedge laying stake. So ranging from about 1.5 inches at the base up to about 1 inch at the top. That's beam poles. And then beyond that, I'm then focusing on rods for weaving. So these can be, for me, anything over 4 foot really, about 1 inch diameter is ideal, but some of these are a little bit bigger than that. They're about 1.25 inches, and I can probably still use that in the panels. Other products that you can get out are pea sticks, which I've not got any. I don't tend to cut for pea sticks because they're a bit of a nightmare to store, because if the frost gets them, they're ruined. So I tend to cut to order on pea sticks. But my advice is, when you're first starting, is to try to think of those 4 or 5 different products when you're trying to cut. Is a real pain. So if you're dealing with something that's overstood, which was what I mentioned, then I would probably say cut for firewood and hedge stakes and beam poles. And then once you've got that mastered and you can see those, admittedly you might be wasting a bit of material, but then you can move on to adding another product in and looking for it. It's just getting used to what you're looking for without getting your tape measure out. Another thing I do is I don't measure rods. I use my feet. So to measure a 5'6" stake, I'll just use my foot. My foot is almost a foot long. It's about 11 point something inches. So I will walk up the rod like that, just pin knobs. Walk up the rod like that. I'll get to 5.5 of my feet and cut it off. Same with beam poles. I walk up 8 foot. I'll add another 6 inches on just for, and these are all in between 8 foot and 9 foot long. That way I know that I'm not shortchanging the customer. And they're about the only things I tend to measure. Firewood I measure as long as my chainsaw. So you'll see in the distance there's a pine I've just felled. That's destined for firewood, and I'll just cross cut that to 3 foot lengths, which is the same length as my chainsaw from handle to tip. So that is some of the basics of coppicing. Probably not covered everything, but it gives you a bit of an idea. If you're just starting out, that's some of the information I found helpful when I first researched it. Hopefully you found that helpful, and if you did, give us a bit of a thumb. By all means, put a message in the comments. If you've got any more questions, I could soon pop another video on about some of the bits I've missed, or if there's info you want to learn about. And if you're not a subscriber yet, by all means subscribe. It'd be great to have you following along, see what we do. Thanks for watching. See you on the next video.